In the year 452, a wave of terror moved across the Italian mainland. Attila, the Hun, descended upon the cities of Padua and Aquileia with fire and conquest, and the people fled. They fled into a place no one wanted, no one valued, a flat lagoon of mud, marsh, and thin water between the sea and the land, islands of reeds and mist, where the mainland ended in a whisper. These were ordinary people, merchants and craftspeople and priests, carrying whatever they could hold, moving into exile without knowing they were building something that would change the world. They had lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their security, and they had only one advantage. They were desperate enough to survive in a place that seemed like death itself. Here, in this worthless mud, with nothing but wooden piles and salt water, they began something that would not die for 1,345 years. They built Venice. Venice would become a name that meant money, power, trade, the conquest of continents without armies. It would become a republic that turned the accident of exile into the architecture of empire. It would invent banking and dominate Mediterranean trade for 1,000 years. But in the beginning, it was just mud and determination, and the refusal to accept that some places are uninhabitable. This is the story of how refugees who lost everything learned to build something on nothing. It is the story of how they turned exile into empire, mud into monuments, and how their choices transformed not just their own lives, but the entire course of human commerce and power. It is the story of Venice. When Attila the Hun sacked Aquileia in the summer of 452, he burned temples and drowned the city in blood. The survivors, Roman citizens of the mainland, merchants, craftspeople, priests, had nowhere to go but water. They took boats into the lagoon that surrounded the tiny islands of Rialto, Torcello, and Malamocco. The city of Altinum, further along the coast, burned as well. The refugees fled west into a place so hostile and so useless that no one would follow them there, carrying what they could hold, abandoning everything else. They were not explorers seeking fortune, they were exiles, unwilling children. The lagoon in those centuries was not what we remember from paintings. It was not picturesque. It was not a tourist marvel. It was a half-world between two states of matter. Not quite water, not quite land. The mud lay thick in places, 15 feet deep or more, the accumulated silt of 10,000 years of rivers flowing down from the Alps. In summer, the smell was of decay and salt and trapped things. In winter, the water was cold enough to paralyze. The reeds grew in tangles, and the salt pans glittered in sunlight like a poisoned garden. The mosquitoes, by some accounts, were so thick that you could not breathe without choking on them. The earliest settlers lived in huts of woven reeds and driftwood, half buried in the mud, built on stilts driven into the soft ground. Their homes were scattered across the lagoon surface, accessible only by boat. Their children often died of fever. Hunger was constant. They ate fish, small grey fish, eels, the occasional bird, and they ate whatever they could coax from the marsh. A Roman official named Cassiodorus, writing in the 6th century, described these lagoon dwellers as people whose homes were dispersed across the water itself, with boats tied at their doors. He noted their focus on salt works and fishing, the tidal rhythms that governed their days, how the withdrawing tide closed access to the sea while the returning flood opened it again. This was one of the first surviving descriptions of the people who would become Venice, written by an outsider who observed their strange way of life with something between fascination and pity. Yet there was one profound advantage to this wasteland, and it was the only advantage that mattered. No one could conquer it. No cavalry could charge through mud. No army wanted it. No barbarian king would waste his conquest on mud. The lagoon was too shallow for invasion, too treacherous to navigate without local knowledge, too worthless to be worth the conquest. And so the refugees stayed. More people fled here as waves of invasions continued. Lombards in 568, further waves of terror from the north, and with each fresh exodus, the lagoon grew more populated. Slowly, almost without intention, they began to organize. Families who had lost everything found that in this together, in this shared misery, they could survive. They began to trade salt, which the lagoon produced endlessly, valuable salt, the kind that preserved meat and fed empires. They began to fish more deliberately, not just to eat, but to sell. They began to understand that this place, however terrible, had something the mainland did not: safety. It had isolation. It had freedom from conquest. By the year 600, there were villages throughout the lagoon. By 700, there was something that looked like a city structure, a loose federation of settlements, each looking out at its own canals and islands. The greatest concentration was at Rialto, where the channels came together, where the soil was slightly firmer, where a market could form. The settlers had learned, through trial and 1,000 small deaths, how to live in mud. They knew which paths would hold a horse, which would swallow you. They knew which reeds could be used for fuel, which for building. They knew the smell of water that would poison you and the smell of water that was safe. They had become, by necessity and repetition, the only people on earth who truly understood this particular piece of hell. And this knowledge, this intimate, hard-won knowledge of the lagoon, would become their first and greatest asset. When kingdoms fell all around them, when Rome itself became dust and memory, when the mainland collapsed into chaos and uncertainty, the refugees and their children and their children's children held their lagoon. They held it because they alone could live there. They held it because they had nothing else. They held it because the shallow water that had seemed like a prison became their shield. Something no army could cross, something that made them invulnerable in a way that no walled city could be. The depth of the lagoon was the key. In most places, the water was only 6 feet deep, sometimes less. A cavalry horse could not charge through mud 6 feet deep. A sailing ship could not navigate water that shallow. An invading army would need to wade, to swim, to abandon the advantages that made them dangerous. The very features that made the lagoon seem worthless to the outside world, its shallowness, its mud, its constant tidal changes, were the features that made it the safest place in a dangerous world. As the centuries passed and invasions continued and new refugees arrived, the settlements that had huddled on the islands learned to spread outward, to claim more of the lagoon. They connected islands with bridges and dikes. They dredged channels to move boats deeper into their territory. They began to understand the lagoon not as a barrier to be endured, but as a kingdom to be organized and exploited. The lagoon had been a refuge from desperation. It was becoming a place of organization, of intention, of controlled growth. By the time the 8th and 9th centuries arrived, the lagoon settlements had developed enough organization that they could function as a unified entity during crisis. When the Frankish Empire sent naval expeditions to threaten the lagoon, the Venetians could coordinate their defense, gathering ships from across the scattered settlements to defend their common home. They understood, without anyone explicitly stating it, that they were no longer a collection of isolated refugees, but a people with shared interests, shared enemies, and a shared determination to survive. And they held it because, slowly, without understanding the future they were building, they were beginning to trade. They were beginning to understand that the mud and water and salt that surrounded them could be transformed into power. And the wealth would be scratched into the mud. To build a city, you need ground. Venice had no ground. It had only water and the idea that ground could be made if you were patient enough and desperate enough to try. In the mud of the lagoon, millions of wooden piles were driven down into the earth. The wood chosen was alder and oak from the northern forests, trees dense enough to resist rot, strong enough to bear weight, felled in vast quantities and transported by water to the construction sites. Archaeologists who have examined the foundations of Venice in modern times have marveled at the precision of this work. Each pile was typically between 30 and 40 centimeters in diameter. Each was driven deep into the anaerobic mud, the mud without oxygen, where something remarkable happened. In that oxygen-free darkness, the wood did not rot. It hardened instead. It became, over the years and decades, as hard as stone, petrified by the very absence of air that would normally have destroyed it. The mud itself, layered and compressed, became almost concrete. Modern engineers have calculated that millions upon millions of these piles were driven into the mud beneath Venice, an astonishing number. A feat of industrial effort sustained over stays. The workers who did this work lived and died by it. Imagine a man standing waist-deep in lagoon water in the summer heat, driving a pile with a hammer, over and over thousands of times, the mud never quite firm enough to stand on, the smell of the water in his nose, his skin beginning to break out in salt sores. Imagine doing this work for days, weeks, months, years. Imagine training your son and your grandson to do the same work, passing down the knowledge of which muds would support weight and which would not, which techniques worked and which had failed 1,000 times before. This was the price of building Venice. On top of these pilings, layer by layer, they laid beams and then boards and then the distinctive Istrian stone, pale, durable stone from the coast across the Adriatic, placed in plates atop the wooden foundations. They built complex systems beneath each building, each layer of wood and stone and brick slowly compressing the earth beneath it into something that could hold weight. And then they built walls, and then they built entire buildings. They also built wells to gather rainwater, a precious resource in a city surrounded by salt lagoon, wells that had to be carefully engineered to avoid contamination. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the process had become routine enough that builders could construct multi-story structures, something that would have seemed impossible 3 centuries earlier. The technique is still not fully understood by modern engineers, but the basic principle is sound. The anaerobic mud and the hardened pilings created a foundation that, while unstable by most standards, was stable enough. It would hold. It held for centuries. The campanili, the bell towers that still lean in Venice today, are living evidence of the slight instability of the ground beneath, yet they have endured for centuries, testimony to the genius of the builders who understood how to work with, rather than against, the mud. By the time the Republic of Venice was formally organized in the 10th century, under leaders they called doges, the city had already performed its first miracle. It existed. A city, an actual city with streets and buildings and markets, stood in the middle of the sea where no city should be. Travelers coming from the mainland would see it in the distance, a shimmer of spires and rooftops rising from water that was only 6 feet deep in most places. They could not quite believe it was real. The architecture itself seemed to defy nature, buildings that appeared to float, churches whose bells rang out over nothing but water in all directions, homes where you could stand on a terrace and see only sky and sea and the city beneath you. This miracle, this impossible city on wooden legs, produced a psychological effect on everyone who encountered it. If these people could build a city in the middle of the sea, what else might they accomplish? If they could overcome geography itself, what could stop them? The Venetians themselves began to believe in the power of their own determination. They had already done the impossible. Everything else was just details. As they drove more piles deeper into the mud, as they perfected their techniques over generations, they discovered something else. They could modify their environment. A canal that was too shallow could be dredged, deepened, widened. Land that was marshy could be built upon with the right techniques. Islands that were separate could be connected with fill and bridges. The tides that had once ruled them could be channeled and directed. They were not, for the first time in human history, living within constraints of nature as passive recipients. They were actively reshaping their world. They were showing that human intelligence and human labor, applied with persistence, could transform even the most hostile landscape into something habitable, something organized, something that could grow and prosper. This was the beginning of Venice, not just as a city, but as a force. The transformation of mud into empire had begun, and it had begun with wood and human stubbornness and a refusal to accept that some places were unlivable. The knowledge required to build on wooden legs became the knowledge required to modify the lagoon itself. The techniques for driving piles became the techniques for dredge channels. The understanding of anaerobic mud became the understanding that the lagoon was not just a place that happened, but a place that could be made, shaped, directed. Every time a Venetian drove a new pile, every time they laid a new stone, every time they dredged a canal deeper, they were saying the same thing. We will not accept limits. We will remake this world in the image of our will. This attitude, this refusal to accept that some places were unconquerable, This belief that human effort and ingenuity could overcome almost any obstacle would define Venice forever. It was an attitude born not of arrogance, but of desperation. They had no choice but to believe it, and in believing it, in acting on it, in proving it true again and again over centuries, they transformed not just their city, but the possibilities of what human beings could achieve through organization, skill, and determination. The first wealth of Venice came not from conquest, but from evaporation. When seawater is trapped in shallow ponds in the sun, the water disappears, but the salt remains. By the 8th century, this process, simple enough to describe, had become the foundation of Venetian prosperity. The lagoon itself was a salt factory. As tidal waters flooded into the low areas around the islands, the Venetians built ponds and channels to direct the water into controlled reservoirs working pan by pan through the seasons. In summer, the water would evaporate gradually, concentrating the salt crystals. When autumn came and the rains returned, the salt would be harvested before being washed away again. In an age before refrigeration, salt was more precious than gold in many contexts. It was the only reliable way to preserve meat and fish so they would not rot. Armies could not move without it. Merchants could not store their goods without it. Cities could not feed themselves without access to salt. Salt was, in effect, the white gold of the medieval world, and Venice had it in quantities that most places could not match. The salt ponds of the lagoon could produce thousands of tons annually. Venetian merchants began to trade this salt, moving it by boat to the mainland, to Dalmatia, to North Africa, slowly establishing a monopoly on salt trade throughout the northern Mediterranean. The Venetian Republic even forced its neighbors to purchase Venetian salt, rather than producing their own, leveraging its control of this vital resource into political power. The salt pans worked through the seasons in geometric patterns, white salt glistening in the sun, the harvest collected in careful stages, each pan producing its quota of crystalline wealth. Cassiodorus, in his 6th century letter, had written that all of your attention is focused on your salt works, and he was describing something that would define Venice for 1,000 years. With the salt trade came the first Venetian commercial networks. A merchant family would organize the harvesting of salt in the summer, would contract with boat owners to transport it, would establish relationships with traders in other cities who would buy it. These were the first steps toward the complex mercantile structure that Venice would later perfect. The families that dominated the salt trade, names like Contarini, Mocenigo, and Dandolo, became the first Venetian aristocracy. They were not warriors or priests. They were traders, and Venice became, from its beginning, a city that honored and elevated those who could move goods from one place to another at a profit. The salt trade also established a crucial principle. The Venetians understood that control of a commodity created power. If you could control the supply of salt, you could control prices. If you could control prices, you could grow rich. And if you grew rich, you could afford better boats, better organization, better soldiers to protect your trade routes. This was capitalism in its most basic form, the pure logic of supply and control, and Venice learned it earlier and more thoroughly than any other European city. Fishing followed salt. The lagoon itself was stocked with fish, grey mullet, eels, little fish whose names have been forgotten. These were not the fish of luxury. They were not what a wealthy man ate, but they were abundant, and they could be dried or salted and traded. Fish weirs were built, elaborate systems of stakes and nets designed to trap fish as the tides moved through them. Eel harvests, in particular, became a specialized trade, with families developing secret knowledge about where and when the eels ran. The fishing families of Venice learned to work the water in every season, developing nets and techniques that were passed down through families over generations. A good fisherman knew the lagoon like a shepherd knows a pasture. He knew where the fish gathered, when they gathered, and how to catch them. He knew how to read the water itself, seeing in its surface ripples invisible to outsiders. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Venice was producing surplus. The city was producing more salt and fish than it needed to eat, and this meant it could trade for other things. Grain from the mainland moved down the rivers from Lombardy and the Veneto, grain that was essential for feeding the city's growing population. Wine from the hills of the mainland, cloth from the northern workshops, woven by hands that had never seen the sea. Trade up the rivers into Lombardy was particularly important. Venetian salt and fish in exchange for the grain that fed the city, for timber, for the goods that could be resold to the south and east. The rivers became highways, and Venice became the toll booth through which goods had to pass. Once trade begins, it tends to accelerate. A merchant in Venice would buy fish from the fisherman, would trade it for cloth in another city, would come back with cloth to sell, would use the profit to buy more fish, more salt, and establish a route to a third city. Trade created wealth, wealth created the ability to buy more goods, and the ability to buy more goods meant the opportunity to create more wealth. This was not complicated economics. It was simply the recognition that if you had something other people wanted, you could exchange it for something you wanted, and the difference between what you bought for and what you sold for was profit. Profit that could then be invested in more goods, more ships, more routes. The rhythm of the lagoon, the rise and fall of the tides, the seasons of harvest, the seasons when the rivers were high and navigation was easy, and the seasons when travel was dangerous, became the rhythm of commerce. Merchants learned to read the seasons as carefully as the fishermen read the water. They planned their expeditions around the tides and the weather, knowing that timing meant everything. A merchant who departed in the right season might reach his destination in weeks. A merchant who departed at the wrong time might take months, if he survived at all. The Venetians were not particularly unusual in this regard. Many medieval cities engaged in trade. Many had merchants, many had organized markets, many understood the basics of buying and selling. But Venice had one crucial advantage. It controlled the interface between the Mediterranean and the northern European rivers. It was positioned, by accident of geography and hard effort, to become a throughput for goods moving in both directions. Every merchant coming from Lombardy with grain or cloth or wine had to come through Venetian territory. Every merchant trying to reach the markets of the north from the south had to pass through Venice. Venice was not just a city, it was a toll station. It was a tax collector. It was the gate through which commerce had to pass. The salt and fish were merely the beginning. They were proof of concept. They showed that the Venetians could organize themselves to produce trade and profit. They showed that the lagoon, which had seemed like a prison, could be productive. They showed that even in a place that had nothing, human effort and organization could create something. Once that was proven, the question became, what else could be moved, traded, and profited from? What other goods could flow through the Venetian gateway? The answer would come soon enough. and it would change everything. It would transform Venice from a collection of fishing villages into a merchant republic. It would make the city wealthy beyond what the first refugees could have imagined. It would give them power that extended across the Mediterranean and beyond. But it all began with salt. It all began with the simplest of transactions: water, sun, evaporation, and the will to profit from even the most basic resources. A city needs laws, a city needs order, a city needs above all a structure that will hold together even as its people change and its wealth shifts. Venice, growing from a collection of refugee villages into an actual state, faced this challenge earlier than most European cities because its situation was so precarious. One bad storm could destroy the dikes, one bad decision could alienate a trading partner and collapse the economy, one conflict between families could tear the whole thing apart. The solution the Venetians devised was to turn their republic into something resembling a corporation, designed to outlast any single man. In the 9th century, they established the position of the Doge, a lifetime chief executive, not a king, but something closer to a very powerful CEO. The Doge was elected through a deliberately absurd multi-stage system: first a nomination, then a ballot, then a lottery to select the electors, then another ballot among those electors, a system so deliberately cumbersome that no single faction could easily control it, a system designed to prevent any Doge from becoming too powerful. The Doge was elected by an assembly of the greatest merchant families, each of whom had significant power. Below the Doge were councils, the Council of Ten, the Great Council that represented the major trading interests. Laws were made not by the whim of a single ruler, but through deliberation and voting, with the understanding that stability served everyone's interests better than chaos. The Great Council's roles were formally closed in 1297, in what became known as the serrata, the closure. Only the families already in the council could remain members. Membership could only pass to their direct descendants. This locked the aristocracy into place, but it also created permanence. A merchant family that invested in Venice could be confident that his descendants would maintain their political power. Stability was guaranteed. This structure was revolutionary because it was not based on hereditary right or divine favor. It was based on the simple recognition that merchants who had invested their wealth in the city would work harder to protect it than mercenaries or conscripts ever would. The Doges of Venice were almost always from the wealthiest merchant families, and while their position was elevated and honorific, it was also carefully circumscribed. A Doge who made bad decisions would find himself surrounded by powerful men who disagreed with him, and his orders would simply not be followed. The Council of Ten, in particular, served as a check on Doge power, capable of overriding decisions, conducting investigations, and managing state security. This system was a machine designed to create stability through balanced power, not perfect harmony. Venice had its internal conflicts, its feuds and betrayals, but a baseline stability that allowed long-term planning, investment, and trade to flourish. A merchant could commit resources to a decade-long trade route, knowing that the government would still be there in 10 years, still honoring contracts, still maintaining the infrastructure of ports and laws and security. The most famous symbol of Venice's relationship with the sea, and the proof of its unique status as a maritime power, was the ceremony of the Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage with the sea. Once each year, in the spring, the Doge would board a ceremonial barge, the Golden Bucintoro, ornate and magnificent, filled with the symbols of Venetian power. As he sailed out into the open lagoon, into the deeper water where Venice's true dominion lay, he would cast a golden ring into the water and recite words that claimed Venice as the bride of the sea. The traditional formula, as it came to be understood, was, "We wed thee, O sea," a statement not quite prayer, not quite magic, but something in between. It was a claim of legal sovereignty, a consecration of power. It said, "This water, this sea, this realm belongs to us. We are married to it. We are one with it." From a practical standpoint, the ceremony was meaningless. The sea recognized no government. The water cared nothing for rings. But as theatre, as symbol, as a statement of identity, it was profound. It said that Venice understood itself not as merely beside the sea, but as of the sea. The lagoon that had begun as a prison, a place of exile where unwanted people fled, had become a kingdom, a space not just inhabited, but claimed, blessed, and consecrated, a space that belonged to the Venetians by right of will and ceremony. The republican structure that Venice developed became, over centuries, a template for later democratic institutions. The idea that power should be distributed, that wealth created responsibility, that government should serve those who had invested in it, these were not ideas that originated in Venice, but Venice proved they could work on a large scale, that they could create stability and prosperity that endured for centuries. The Doge's palace became, over time, a symbol not of tyranny, but of managed power, of aristocratic restraint in the service of merchant interests. The very geography of Venice, the Doge's palace adjacent to the basilica, the council rooms opening onto the plaza, the public nature of the decision-making process reflected the commitment to openness and accountability, or at least the appearance of it. Power was visible, power was bounded, power was distributed among many rather than concentrated in one. By the 11th century, the Venetian Republic had consolidated its power over the lagoon and had begun to expand outward, establishing military and trade dominance in the Adriatic Sea. The Byzantine Empire to the east recognized Venice and granted trading it privileges, allowing Venetian merchants to operate in Constantinople with lower taxes and better access than competitors. The Papal States to the south negotiated with Venice as an equal, neither able to dominate the other, but both understanding that cooperation served their interests. The Kingdom of Hungary to the north sought Venetian merchants for its trade, wanting access to the goods and networks that Venice controlled. Venice was no longer a city in any ordinary sense. It had become a state. It was no longer a refuge for the desperate. It had become a model of stability that others envied and sought to emulate, and a model of power that others feared. The transformation had taken perhaps 300 years. 3 centuries from the moment refugees fled into the mud to the moment when Venice was recognized as a power equal to empires and kingdoms. This was not quick, not by the standards of ambitious men, but by the standards of human institutions, by the standards of cities and states and complex organizations. It was astonishingly fast. The refugees had taken a place that no one wanted and had built something that everyone wanted to know about, to trade with, to ally with. They had proven that human determination and intelligence could overcome almost any obstacle, even the obstacle of having no natural advantages at all. In the year 1202, the Republic of Venice faced a turning point that would define its future. A fleet of crusaders, gathered from across France and the Low Countries for the Fourth Crusade. The great expedition that was supposed to reclaim Jerusalem arrived in Venice, seeking transportation by sea. The mission was to sail to Egypt, to strike at the heart of Muslim power in the Mediterranean. The Venetians calculated the cost of building and manning the necessary ships, and the cost was enormous. They would need to devote their entire shipbuilding capacity for months. The Crusaders, for their part, agreed to pay a sum of money that would make the effort profitable. Contracts were drawn up, construction began. But the Crusaders could not pay. Some sailed from other ports, some were delayed, scattered, slow to gather. When the fleet actually arrived in Venice, it was less than half the size that had been promised. The Venetians had built ships for 60,000 Crusaders and received 30,000. The math was simple and brutal. The Crusaders could not afford to hire the fleet. The Doge of Venice at this time was Enrico Dandolo, a man in his late 80s or early 90s, blind for decades but still sharp-minded, a merchant and a strategist who had lived longer than most men expected to live. He was old enough to remember Constantinople from an earlier time, experienced enough to see opportunities where others saw only problems. He saw an opportunity in the Crusaders' debt, and he took it. Instead of accepting a partial payment that would leave Venice with a loss, he offered the Crusaders a choice. They could help Venice take a city first, and with the proceeds, they could afford to pay Venice and continue to the Holy Land. It was, in essence, a business proposal dressed up as charity. The city he pointed them toward was Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, a city that had once belonged to Venice and had slipped from its grasp. In 1202, the Crusaders sacked Zara at Venice's direction, under the command of the elderly Doge, who was old enough to remember Venice's ownership of it. The city was Christian, Byzantine Christian, but it was also an enemy of Venice, and that was enough. The Fourth Crusade had already begun to deviate from its holy purpose, had already become an instrument of Venetian commercial interest. The warriors who had left home to reclaim Jerusalem found themselves instead being used to reclaim Venetian territory. But this was only the beginning of the diversion. From Zara, the fleet sailed not toward Egypt, but toward Constantinople. There were Venetian merchants in Constantinople who had grievances against the Byzantine rulers. There was a Venetian pretender to the Byzantine throne who offered payment for support, money that could be used to pay off the Crusaders' debt. There were rumors of wealth beyond imagining in the great Christian capital of the East. By 1204, the Crusaders, under the direction of Venice and the will of the aged Doge who led them personally, had turned away from the Holy Land entirely and had instead sacked Constantinople, one of the oldest and greatest cities in Christendom. The sack was thorough and brutal. The Crusaders and Venetian sailors moved through the city, looting treasures that had accumulated for 1,000 years. They stripped the churches of their silver and gold and relics. They took icons and manuscripts and objects of such beauty and historical weight that their destruction or loss to Western hands diminished the world. Among the treasures were the bronze horses that had once stood in the stadium of the Byzantine emperors. These 4 horses, ancient Greek art of extraordinary beauty, were carried back to Venice and installed in the Basilica of San Marco, where they have stood ever since. A trophy of warfare, a symbol of Venetian power and Venetian ruthlessness. The sack of Constantinople was morally indefensible, historically catastrophic, and from a commercial standpoint enormously profitable. The partition of the Byzantine Empire that followed the sack gave Venice control of crucial trading posts and islands throughout the Mediterranean. Venice claimed a quarter and a half a quarter of the empire, as the historians would later write, a strange accounting of conquest that reflected the Byzantine system of dividing power and territory. Venice's merchants gained control of Crete. They gained the islands of the Aegean. They gained access to markets in Egypt and the Levant, to ports and trading posts that had been closed to them under Byzantine rule. The city that had begun as a lagoon of mud became, in one terrible and brilliant act of betrayal, the greatest sea power in the Mediterranean. The wealth that flowed into Venice as a result was immense. The treasures taken from Constantinople, the gold, the silver, the relics, the artworks, gave Venice resources to rebuild, to expand, to invest in the future. The trading privileges gave them access to markets and goods that would enrich them for centuries. The geopolitical position gave them power that would echo through Mediterranean politics for generations. It was a gamble that paid off completely. The Crusaders never reached Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade became instead a mechanism for Venetian imperialism. The city of God was sacrificed on the altar of profit. But this was how empires were built in the medieval world, not through moral clarity, but through clarity of interest, not through honoring agreements, but through understanding when an agreement had become irrelevant. Venice understood this better than any city in Europe, and this understanding gave it the ruthlessness to act when moral hesitation would have paralyzed others. While Christian warriors were worrying about sin and redemption, Venetian merchants were calculating profit and loss. The horses of San Marco still stand in Venice, still visible to visitors, though the originals are now inside the basilica, protected from the weather. They are beautiful things, magnificent things. And they are also accusations. They say, this is what empire builds itself on. This is the price of power. This is what happens when trade and opportunity override all other considerations. They are a reminder that Venice's rise to power was built not just on ingenuity and hard work, but on ruthlessness, on the willingness to betray, to plunder, to sacrifice principle for profit. They are a reminder that the same qualities that made Venice successful, clarity of interest, focus on advantage, willingness to act decisively, are also qualities that enable terrible things. If Venice was to maintain the power it had seized in the Fourth Crusade and continue to dominate Mediterranean trade, it needed ships. Not just a few ships, but dozens, hundreds of ships, and it needed them continuously. The Venetian Republic faced a challenge that no medieval state had ever solved: how to produce warships at scale, reliably, cost-effectively, and with quality control. The answer was the arsenal. Founded around the year 1104, the arsenal is a small shipyard on the eastern edge of Venice. By the 13th century, it had become something entirely new, not merely a shipyard, but a factory. It was the first true assembly line in human history, predating Henry Ford by more than 800 years. The poet Dante visited the arsenal and was so impressed or so horrified by the organized industrial labor, the workers in coordinated sequence, the boiling pitch being applied to seams, that he would later use the arsenal as the model for one of the circles of hell in his Inferno, the place where souls are boiled in pitch. The arsenal was entirely controlled by the Venetian state. The Grand Arsenal, as it became known, employed at its peak somewhere around 16,000 workers. These were not independent craftsmen working in isolation. They were organized into a hierarchy: shipwrights, carpenters, caulkers, sailmakers, rope makers, blacksmiths, each performing specific tasks in a sequence. A new ship would enter one end of the arsenal, and as it moved through the facility, different teams would add different components. The frame would be erected, the planks would be fastened, the caulking would be applied with boiling pitch that could burn you if you were careless. The mast would be fitted, the sails would be attached. Everything happened in sequence. Nothing held up, nothing waited. The methods they used were revolutionary. They standardized parts so that components could be made in advance and quickly assembled rather than custom-built for each ship. They organized the workflow so that no step depended on waiting for another step. Everything flowed. They maintained careful records of costs and materials so they could calculate efficiency and identify waste. They created a hierarchy of positions and compensation so that skilled workers could specialize and advance. The rope works were famous, producing rope at a scale and speed that supplied not just Venice, but all of Europe. The biscuit ovens baked the hard bread that fed sailors on long voyages. Every function of a ship was somewhere in the arsenal, working in coordination. In the 16th century, King Henry III of France visited Venice, and the Doge decided to demonstrate the power of the arsenal. During the time it took the king to eat his ceremonial, dinner, the meal where every octable, down to the plates and cutlery, was made of sugar as a demonstration of Venetian artifice, the arsenal workers assembled and launched a complete galley, fully equipped and armed. It was, by some accounts, one of the greatest demonstrations of industrial capability ever made. Whether it took the 2 hours of his meal or whether it was faster or slower, the point was clear. Venice could build in hours what other nations took weeks to build. In the 16th century, Venetian officials boasted that the arsenal could construct a warship, a complete galley, fully armed and provisioned, in a single day. Not a week, not a month, a day. By some accounts, they once built a ship while dignitaries watched, completing it in a few hours. Whether this was always achievable or merely a demonstration of peak capability is uncertain, but the claim itself reveals something about the Venetian mind at its height. They believed they had conquered not just the sea, but time and production itself. The effect on Venetian power was enormous. Before the arsenal, a maritime power might have 5 or 10 warships. Venice, at the height of its capability, could have hundreds. When enemies of Venice threatened to match its naval strength, Venice could outbuild them by an order of magnitude. When a storm damaged Venetian ships, the arsenal could replace them faster than new ships could be built anywhere else. The arsenal was not merely a tool, it was the fundamental basis of Venetian dominance. The arsenal also served as a symbol of Venetian values and capabilities. When diplomats from other nations visited Venice, they were brought to the arsenal to see the workers at their labor, to see the ships being constructed, to understand that Venice had industrialized in a way no other nation had achieved. The message was clear. You cannot defeat us at sea because we can build ships faster than you can destroy them. You cannot starve us into submission because our maritime capability cannot be matched. We are not just a city, we are a machine. The arsenal workers became a distinct social class in Venice, with jobs that were wheelchair, jobs that were hereditary, passed from father to son through generations. They were not quite merchants, not quite nobles, not quite common labourers. They were the makers of ships, and ships were power, and so they were powerful. They wore distinctive clothes, had their own neighbourhoods, formed their own social organisations. Arsenal workers were respected in Venice in a way that ordinary labourers were not, because everyone understood that without the arsenal, without these men and their skills, to be powerless. To be an arsenal lotto, an arsenal worker, was to be part of something larger than yourself, to be essential to the survival and power of the Republic. The arsenal also created the conditions for innovation. With so many skilled craftsmen working in such close proximity, sharing techniques and ideas, design improvements happened constantly. A new way to attach a sail might be tried in the arsenal and spread throughout the facility if it proved defective. A new curve to the hull that improved speed would be incorporated into the next ship. Over centuries, designs became steadily more sophisticated, more efficient, more capable. The arsenal was not just producing ships, it was continuously improving the art of ship production, creating innovations in naval architecture that would spread throughout Europe. By the 13th century, Venice had achieved something remarkable. It had created an entirely new category of business structure, a way of organizing commerce that was more sophisticated than anything that had come before. The innovation was called the colleganza, and it was the medieval equivalent of a limited partnership or investment fund. Here is how it worked. A wealthy merchant in Venice had accumulated capital, money, goods, ships, but he was aging or he had other concerns. A younger, more ambitious merchant approached him with a trade route in mind, perhaps a journey to Alexandria to buy spices, or to the shores of the Black Sea to acquire furs, or to Constantinople to trade in manufactured goods. The younger merchant had intelligence and energy, but lacked capital. The two would make a deal. The older merchant would provide the capital, the younger would lead the expedition, and when the ship returned and the goods were sold, they would split the profits according to an agreed ratio. This structure was radical because it allowed capital and labor to be combined without requiring the capital provider to do the labor himself, and without requiring the laborer to own capital. It created what later economists would recognize as the joint stock company. It created a system where money could work for you, even when you were not personally at sea. It created, in essence, the modern business system, 600 years before the modern corporation was formally invented. The colleganza was not invented by philosophers but by merchants who needed to solve a practical problem: how to finance more expeditions than they could personally lead. The beauty of the system was that it scaled. One merchant could have capital in 5 colleganza at once, money working in 5 different directions simultaneously, spreading risk and multiplying opportunity. A successful merchant family in Venice might have relatives leading expeditions to 5 different cities, all funded through capital pooled from the family's wealth. Marco Polo was the most famous of these merchant adventurers. In 1271, when he was about 17 years old, he traveled from Venice with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, heading east through Central Asia along routes that would later be called the Silk Road. They traveled for years through deserts and mountains across territories controlled by various khans and rulers. They reached the court of Kublai Khan in Cathay, China, and were received as honored guests. Marco Polo stayed in Cathay for about 2 decades, learning the languages and customs, sometimes serving the Khan, sometimes conducting trade. When he finally returned to Venice in 1295, he brought back accounts of a world that most Venetians could not have imagined, a continent of enormous wealth, sophisticated cities, vast networks of trade that made the Mediterranean seem provincial. Marco Polo's travels were possible because the Colleganza system had matured enough to finance such ambitious projects. His family was wealthy enough to commit capital to such a venture without fear of bankruptcy if it failed. The routes he traveled had been partially established by Venetian and Genoese merchants before him, which meant that safe passages existed in places where previously there were only dangers. And his journey was undertaken in an era when Mongolian control over Central Asia had created a period of relative stability, the Pax Mongolica, which made such long-distance travel more feasible than it would have been before. The spice trade was always the great prize. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg were worth their weight in silver and sometimes more than their weight in gold. They were not luxuries for the wealthy, but essential components of medieval cuisine and medicine. They preserved meat, they hid the taste of spoiling, they were believed to cure ailments from depression to sexual impotence. If a merchant could import spices and sell them in Venice, he could make profits of 500% or more. The challenge was getting them. Spices grew in the Far East, in India, in the islands of Southeast Asia. The overland routes through Central Asia were perilous and expensive. The sea route around Africa did not yet exist. It would not exist for another century. So trade in spices meant dealing with Muslim intermediaries who controlled the traditional routes, paying tolls and taxes at every step, working through complex networks of relationships and trust. Venice mastered this system better than any other European city. Venetian merchants learned the languages of trade, not just their own Italian, but Arabic, Persian, Greek, the languages of the ports where they conducted business. They established permanent colonies in the great trading cities: Alexandria, Acre, Constantinople, Beirut, with warehouses, agents, and family members who stayed around to manage the trade. They developed reputations for trustworthiness and reliability that allowed them to do business on credit, to accept promises of payment, to work in systems where personal honor was as important as law. By the 14th century, the volume of Venetian trade had created a need for a new kind of financial tool: the letter of credit. A merchant in Venice who wanted to buy goods in Alexandria could write a letter to his agent in Alexandria saying that the bearer of this letter has authority to withdraw money up to a certain amount on my account. The agent would verify the authenticity of the letter and provide the money. This was in ancestors of the modern bank check. It allowed merchants to conduct business without physically transporting large amounts of coin, which was dangerous and inefficient. The combination of all these innovations, the colleganza, the permanent trading colonies, the multilingual merchant class, the letter of credit, created a commercial system that was more advanced than anything else in medieval Europe, and arguably more advanced than anything else in the world. Venice was not the largest state, not the strongest military power, but it was the most sophisticated commercial machine. And this sophistication translated into power. Through commerce, Venice could influence who became wealthy and who became poor, which cities thrived and which declined, which rulers could afford armies and which could not. A Venetian decision to redirect trade away from a particular city could cause economic collapse. A Venetian agreement to provide favorable terms could allow a city to flourish. Venice's true power was not in its soldiers but in its merchants, and its true weapon was not the sword but the ledger. By 1284, the Venetian state decided that this commercial system needed a gold standard, a currency that would be accepted everywhere and would be reliable. The result was the ducat, a gold coin containing approximately 3.5 grams of pure gold at nearly 99% purity. The ducat was minted for the first time in 1284, and it immediately became one of the most trusted and stable currencies in the world. A merchant could accept a ducat as payment and be confident that he could trade it for goods anywhere. The ducat competed with the Florentine florin for status as the world's currency, most reliable currency. By many accounts, the ducat eventually achieved supremacy in trade in the Mediterranean. The ducat was Muslim lands. And it said, this Venice, this is the coin we trust. This is the measure of our commitment to stable value. For over 500 years, until Napoleon ended the Venice Republic in 1797, the ducat remained essentially unchanged in weight and purity. A ducat minted in 1284 would be accepted as the same value as a ducat minted in 1500 or 1700. This consistency created trust. Trust created trade. Trade created power. If the arsenal was the body of Venetian power, the Rialto was its mind. The Rialto was not a place of physical production, but of abstract value, calculation, credit, the transformation of goods into money and back into goods. The Rialto was a marketplace, but it was also much more. From the 12th century onward, beneath the porticos of the church at Campo San Giacomo, money changers established benches, called banchi in Italian, where they conducted their trade. These men, the money changers, were not creating money, but they were doing something almost as important. They were certifying it, converting it from one form to another, taking a small commission for their service. A Venetian merchant returning from Alexandria would have coins from multiple sources: Byzantine hyperpurse, Egyptian dinars, various regional currencies that he had accumulated in trade. These coins were of different weights, different purities, different origins. A money changer could evaluate each coin, weigh it, test its purity, and then offer to exchange it for Venetian currency or for another currency that the merchant needed. This service was essential because trade was impossible without it. Without the money changers, every transaction would require the parties to negotiate not just about the value of goods, but about the validity of payment itself. Over time, the money changers began to offer additional services. A merchant who had sold goods but not yet received payment might deposit his money with a money changer who would hold it safely. When the merchant needed to withdraw the money, he would come back to the money changer's bench. These deposits eventually led to the practice of credit. If a money changer was holding deposits from multiple merchants, he might lend out some of that money to someone else at interest and keep the difference. This was the beginning of banking. The innovation of the 13th century was to transform this system into something more formal and reliable. The money changers developed what was called a banca discreta, a bank of written records. Instead of physically transferring money between parties, the bank would write a record in its ledger, transferring credit from one merchant to another. A merchant who wanted to pay another merchant could go to the bank with a written order, an ancestor of the modern check, and authorize the bank to transfer money from his account to the payee's account. The payee could then draw on this credit whenever he needed it. This system had an enormous advantage. It reduced the amount of physical money that needed to move through the city. It made business faster because transactions that would take hours of coin counting and weighing could be done in minutes through written transfers. It created safety because merchants no longer needed to carry large amounts of actual coin through the streets where robbers might be watching. It created flexibility because credit could be extended to trusted merchants, allowing them to operate on a larger scale than their immediate cash resources would permit. By the 14th century, the Rialto had become the financial center of the Mediterranean. Merchants from across Europe, Asia, and Africa came to the Rialto to change money, to deposit goods for safekeeping, to arrange credit, to trade financial instruments. The money changers' benches had become the most important marketplace in Venice, more important in some senses than the markets for physical goods. The Venetian state regulated the bankers carefully. A money changer had to post a bond to operate his banca, a guarantee that if something went wrong, if money disappeared, if a merchant lost deposits through theft or fraud, there would be compensation. The state also restricted who could be a money changer. The privilege was reserved for wealthy merchants who had the capital to post the required bond. In this way, banking became not just a service, but a jealously guarded privilege. One particular innovation of the Rialto system was the bill of exchange. A merchant in Alexandria who wanted to send money to Venice could go to a money changer in Alexandria, deposit his money, and receive a written bill. This bill was a promise from the money changer in Alexandria that his associate in Venice would pay the bearer of the bill the equivalent amount when presented. The merchant could then send his servant or his agent to Venice, hand over the bill to the associated money changer, and withdraw the money in Venetian currency. The bill of exchange solved an enormous problem. It allowed money to be transferred over long distances without actually moving coins, which was dangerous, slow, and expensive. Bills of exchange eventually became so standardized that they became a form of currency themselves. A merchant who received a bill of exchange from a reliable money changer could use that bill to pay other merchants without having to cash it first. The bill circulated like money, and the money changer's reputation was the guarantee of its value. The Venetian Republic began issuing its own bills of exchange, essentially creating a form of government-backed paper currency, centuries before such things were common. The structure that emerged at the Rialto was, in essence, the first modern financial system. It had fixed deposit banking, it had credit, it had bills of exchange, it had interest rates set by supply and demand, it had risk assessment. Money changers would charge higher interest rates to lend to riskier borrowers and lower rates to more reliable borrowers. It had a regulatory framework set by the state to ensure safety and reliability. It had professional standards and social prestige attached to operating as a banker. The success of the Rialto system created something almost unprecedented: wealth that was not tied to physical production or military conquest, but to financial manipulation and trust. A money changer who started with modest resources could become wealthy through intelligent lending and careful assessment of credit risk. A merchant could multiply his capital through leverage, borrowing money to finance larger expeditions than he could afford with his own resources, and using the profits to pay back the loans with interest and keep the surplus. Finance became not just a service, but a source of power in itself. By the 15th century, the Rialto had become more important to Venice than the arsenal. More important than the salt ponds, more important even than the merchant fleet. This was the transformation of Venice from a city that moved physical goods into a city that moved money, credit, and financial instruments. This was the maturation of Venetian capitalism. This was how a city with no natural resources, no hinterland to support it, no significant agriculture or manufacturing except for ships, had become the wealthiest power in the Mediterranean. It did it through intelligence, trust, and the manipulation of abstract value. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. The news reached Venice like the diagnosis of a terminal disease, and in some sense it was. For centuries, Constantinople had been the heart of the Byzantine Empire, Venice's great rival and its essential partner, the place where Venetian merchants could sell goods, where Venetian capital could be invested, where Venetian power could be exercised. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, the entire system that had enriched Venice came under pressure. The Ottoman Empire was not Venice's friend. The Ottomans had their own ideas about who should control Mediterranean trade, and Venice's privileged position did not fit into their plans. Venetian merchants were expelled from Constantinople. Venetian trading posts in the eastern Mediterranean were seized or pressured to close. The taxes charged on Venetian goods increased. The routes that had been secure became dangerous. The centuries of Venetian domination in the Mediterranean were not ending in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, grinding decline, like a ship taking on water very gradually, so gradually that the crew does not notice until the deck is already half submerged. Worse was coming. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. This voyage accomplished something that had seemed impossible. It created a route to the spice markets that did not require going through the Middle East, did not require dealing with Muslim intermediaries, did not require paying the taxes and tolls that had enriched the Ottoman Empire and its trading partners. Instead, European merchants could now sail directly to the source of spices, cutting out the middlemen, reducing costs, and undercutting Venice's trade entirely. Spices that Venice paid enormous sums to obtain from Muslim traders could now be imported by Portugal and Spain directly and sold in European markets at prices far below what Venice charged. The supply of spices increased dramatically. Prices collapsed. The enormous margins that Venetian merchants had relied on disappeared. The wealth engine of Venice began to seize up. This was not a single catastrophe, but a series of them, a domino effect of historical changes that no one could have predicted or prevented. The Ottoman advance into the Mediterranean was not Venice's fault. The Portuguese discovery of the Cape route was not an event that Venice could have anticipated or prevented. But the combination of these two historical currents was devastating to Venetian interests. Yet Venice did not collapse in 1453 or 1498. The Republic continued for another 300 years. This was a testament to the diversity of Venetian wealth and the sophistication of Venetian institutions. Unlike a kingdom that relied on a single economy, that relied on a single trade route, Venice had built sufficient complexity that it could survive the loss of individual sources of income. Banking continued. The arsenal continued to produce ships to be a center of trade, even if the scale was diminished. Venice was wounded, but it was not killed. What was killed was the hope of unlimited expansion, the sense that Venice was the inevitable future of commerce, that Venetian power was unchecked and uncheckable. From the early 16th century onward, Venice was in competition with nation-states that had just begun to discover how to project maritime power. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, these European powers had resources that Venice, as a city-state, could not match. They had large territories to supply soldiers and resources. Venice had only the Lagoon. The advance of plague in the 16th and 17th centuries added another wound. Trade that passed through ports where plague was active became risky. Insurance costs rose. Some routes were abandoned entirely. The city of Venice itself suffered repeated epidemics that killed a significant fraction of its population. These demographic collapses disrupted the continuity of knowledge and relationships that had always been Venice's strength. When young merchants died before they could train their successors, when entire merchant families disappeared in a single year of plague, the institutional knowledge of Venice was damaged in ways that could not be quickly repaired. By the 17th century, Venice was still wealthy, still important, but it was no longer the power in the Mediterranean. The balance of power had shifted. Other cities, other states, other merchant networks had grown to rival or exceed Venetian capabilities. Venice was becoming, gradually, a relic, still functioning, still prosperous by comparison with most other cities, but no longer supreme. The 18th century saw Venice decline further. The great European powers, France, Britain, Austria, Russia, had carved up the Mediterranean world between them. Venice was a minor power, consulted out of respect for its historical importance, but not a true player in the great game of nations. Venice's ships were fewer, its merchants less dominant, its wealth less overwhelming. In 1797, the end came. Napoleon, the French revolutionary general, had no use for an ancient republic that represented everything the French Revolution was supposed to destroy: aristocracy, privilege, hereditary power. He invaded the Venetian territories, and there was no serious resistance. The Venetian Republic, which had endured for more than 1,300 years, which had survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottoman conquest, the discovery of the New World, was dissolved in a few weeks of military action. The last Doge of Venice, Ludovico Manin, formally abdicated on the 12th of May, 1797, ending the Republic. In his resignation, he reportedly said words that captured the mood: "I do not know if I shall be the last Doge, but if I am content." The republic that had ruled the Mediterranean was surrendered, almost without struggle, to an army that had defeated it in the name of principles that Venice would never have accepted but could no longer resist. The end was not dramatic. It was procedural and quiet. The councils met. They voted. They accepted the inevitable. The symbols of the Republic, the Doge's ring, the banners, the insignia of office, were packed away. The great machine that had produced wealth and power for over a millennium came to rest. Not with a bang, but with the quiet resignation of old age meeting younger, stronger forces. What Venice had built, however, did not end with the Republic. The colleganza system became the model for modern joint stock companies. The bill of exchange became the ancestor of the modern check. The practices of the Rialto moneychangers became the foundation of modern banking. The arsenal's assembly line and standardized parts became the model for all industrial production. The mercantile system that Venice had invented was taken up by other cities, other nations, and refined and expanded. What Venice had created in isolation became, through the spread of its ideas and practices, the foundation of the modern global economy. The Venetian Republic is gone, dissolved into history, its government dispersed, its power transferred to hands, its dominion over the Mediterranean ended. But Venice itself remains, stubborn and strange, a city that should not exist, built on wood and mud and the determination of people who refuse to accept that some places are uninhabitable. Walk through Venice today and you are walking through a history written in stone and water. The wooden peelings that were driven into the mud 800 or 900 years ago are still there, beneath the city, still hard, still supporting the weight of buildings that have stood for centuries. In some places, archaeologists have excavated the peelings and found them almost perfectly preserved in the anaerobic mud, as if time had no power to touch them. The technique of building on wooden legs was so successful that Venice has survived for 1,000 years on a foundation that was invented by refugees with no other options. The arsenal still stands, though it is no longer a factory. It is now a museum and a historical site. But its presence still dominates the eastern edge of Venice. When you walk through the gates and see the enormous open spaces where ships were once built at an impossible rate, where the sounds of carpentry and metalwork and sawing once filled the air, you get a sense of the industrial power that Venice once possessed. The arsenal reminds you that Venice was not just a city of merchants and bankers. It was a city of makers, of people who could build things at a scale and speed that seemed almost miraculous to their contemporaries. The Rialto remains the heart of Venice, though the moneychangers' benches are gone, replaced by tourist shops and restaurants. But if you know what to look for, you can still see the traces of the financial system that once operated there. The architecture of the surrounding buildings, the position of the Rialto Bridge, the layout of the Campo itself, all of these were designed by and for merchants who needed to do business quickly and efficiently. The physical arrangement of the space still reflects the needs of trade, even though the trade itself has been replaced by spectacle. The Doge's palace still stands in the Piazza San Marco, and you can walk through its rooms and see where the councils met, where the Doge held court, where the decisions that affected half the Mediterranean were made. The palace is no longer a seat of power. It is a museum where tourists take photographs. But the building itself is beautiful, and there is something poignant about walking through these spaces and understanding that they once held the gravity of actual power, the weight of decisions that would be carried by merchants across the world and enacted in distant ports. The Basilica of San Marco still contains the bronze horses that were looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. They stand high above the entrance, visible from the plaza, and they are beautiful things. They are also accusations, they say. This is what Venice built itself on, not on purity but on pragmatism, not on honor but on intelligence, not on virtue but on ruthlessness tempered by competence. They are magnificent sculptures, and they are the spoils of war and plunder, and Venice does not hide this contradiction. The horses remain on display, and anyone who visits can see them and draw their own conclusions. The water that once made Venice powerful is now making it powerless. The lagoon, which provided safety and security to refugees, which allowed Venetian merchants to dominate Mediterranean trade, protected by natural geography, is slowly returning the city to the sea from which it emerged. Climate change and rising seas have increased the frequency of the phenomenon called acqua alta, high water, when the lagoon floods the streets of Venice and salt water enters the buildings. In the 20th century, Venice sank about 23 centimeters as the soft ground beneath the city compressed under the weight of centuries. In the 20th century, the sea is rising to meet the city. The process is slow, but it is inexorable. The city that refugees built to escape one calamity may be facing another, not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual one, the slow reversion of a city that should never have been built to the conditions that preceded it. Yet Venice remains a powerful symbol of something that is difficult to name. It is a symbol of dissonation, determination, of human refusal to accept limits, of the power of human intelligence to solve problems that seem impossible. The people who founded Venice were not special people. They were ordinary refugees, fleeing terror, with nothing but the clothes they wore and what they could carry. They were forced into an impossible situation, and they responded not by accepting defeat, but by solving the problem. They learned to live in mud. They learned to build in water. They learned to organize themselves to survive. And in surviving, they built something magnificent. Venice is also a symbol of the danger of power unchecked, of the way that economic success can lead to moral compromise, of the way that the pursuit of profit can override concerns about justice. The Fourth Crusade was launched to reclaim Jerusalem, and it ended in the plunder of Constantinople, all in the name of commerce and debt repayment. The arsenal made Venice powerful, but it also made Venice a war machine that devastated its rivals and pursued imperial expansion at the cost of enormous human suffering. The bankers of the Rialto created a sophisticated financial system that allowed for the creation of wealth, but it also created inequality and economic dependence that favored the wealthy and powerful over ordinary people. These contradictions between necessity and greed, between intelligence and ruthlessness, between the desire to build and the willingness to destroy, are not unique to Venice. They are endemic to capitalism, to commerce, to the pursuit of power and wealth. Venice just happened to be the first place in Europe where these patterns played out with such clarity and so much success. Venice is a lesson in how to create power through commerce and organization. It is also a warning about what that power can become when it is not constrained by anything other than self-interest. Tourists walk through Venice today, taking photographs, buying trinkets, eating overpriced meals in the plaza of San Marco. They see a beautiful city, a romantic city, a city that is almost a fantasy, so removed from the modern world that it seems timeless. They do not usually think about the wooden pilings beneath their feet, or the merchant networks that once controlled trade across 3 continents, or the iron discipline that it took to transform mud into empire. They see the surface, and they see the beauty. What lies beneath, the achievement, the cost, the complexity, is mostly invisible. But if you sit by a canal at sunset and watch the light turn the water gold, if you hear the sound of water lapping against the ancient stones, if you feel the quiet weight of centuries pressing down, then perhaps you begin to sense it. You sense that this place was built by human will and intelligence applied to an impossible problem, and that will and intelligence changed the world. You sense that something great was accomplished here, something magnificent and terrifying, and that the world is still shaped by what was learned and done in this city of mud and water and wooden legs. Venice is sinking. The city is slowly returning to the lagoon from which it emerged. In another century or two, perhaps Venice will be uninhabitable, reclaimed by the water that allowed it to exist. Or perhaps the Venetians, drawing on 1,300 years of experience in living in impossible places, will find a way to save their city again, to drive new piles, to build new walls, to hold back the water through intelligence and stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat. Venice has always survived the unsurvivable. It may do so again. Or it may finally yield, and the lagoon may reclaim what it lost 1,000 years ago, when refugees arrived with nothing but determination and the willingness to work with mud. Either way, Venice will remain a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept their circumstances as final. The city that should never have existed taught the world how to trade, how to build, how to organize for power and profit. It taught lessons through 1,000 years of success, and finally through an eclipse that took 2 centuries. Those lessons are still being learned, Those lessons still being applied, still determining the shape of human civilization. The Ritz built remains. The example remains. The city made remains.